Hello, welcome to the Whispered Abyss channel. Happy viewing. The rain drummed against the windows of the thrift store, muffling the faint sound of jazz playing on an ancient radio. Elena Morris ducked inside, shaking off her damp umbrella. The scent of old leather and mothballs hit her immediately, but she didn't mind. She loved places like this, the kind where you could lose hours searching through forgotten treasures. Elena needed inspiration. Her recent artwork felt lifeless, her creativity drained. Maybe, just maybe, she could find something here to spark her imagination. "Anything I can help you with?" came a raspy voice. Elena turned to see the shopkeeper, an elderly man with cloudy eyes, watching her from behind the counter. He looked as though he hadn't moved in years, rooted among stacks of books and trinkets. "Just browsing," she replied with a polite smile. She wandered the aisles, her fingers brushing against dusty knickknacks, vintage jewelry, and faded photographs. Nothing called out to her until she reached the far corner of the store. There, propped on a cracked mannequin head, was a mask unlike anything she'd ever seen. It was made of a material that looked like a mix of porcelain and bone, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when she stared too long. The eye holes were deep and empty, yet they seemed to watch her. Elena hesitated before lifting it. The mask felt unnaturally cold, and a shiver ran through her. It wasn't heavy, but it seemed to carry a weight nonetheless. "Interesting piece, isn't it?" the shopkeeper said, suddenly beside her. She jumped, almost dropping the mask. "You startled me." "Apologies," he said with a faint smile. "That one doesn't see many buyers. It's peculiar." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, examining the mask more closely. "Some say it has a way of revealing truths," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But not everyone is ready for the truths it shows." Elena laughed nervously. "Sounds ominous." "It's not for everyone," the shopkeeper continued. "Be careful of what you hear." For a moment, she thought about putting the mask back, but curiosity got the better of her. "How much?" The shopkeeper paused as if considering. 20. But once it's yours, it's yours." Elena handed him a crumpled bill, and he wrapped the mask in old newspaper. As she left the store, clutching her purchase, the rain seemed heavier, colder. Walking back to her apartment, she thought she heard faint murmurs behind her, but every time she turned, there was only the empty street. Would the mask inspire her, or had she just invited something sinister into her life? Elena placed the mask on a wooden shelf in her studio, positioning it carefully between a stack of sketchbooks and a jar of paintbrushes. It didn't quite fit with the mess of her workspace, but its presence was undeniable. The rain still pattered on her windows as she brewed a mug of tea, the warm steam curling into the cool air. She sat at her easel, staring at a blank canvas. The mask seemed to watch her from its perch, its hollow eyes daring her to create. "All right, let's see what you can inspire," she muttered, picking up her pencil. The hours stretched on as she sketched feverishly, the outlines of a haunting figure taking shape. It wasn't something she consciously chose to draw. It felt as though her hand moved of its own accord. By the time she realized how late it had gotten, her tea had gone cold. Elena stood and stretched, glancing back at the mask. For a brief moment, she thought its eye holes were darker, deeper than before. She blinked and shook her head. It was just her imagination. "Too much caffeine," she whispered to herself. As she got ready for bed, she left the mask in the studio. She didn't want it in her bedroom. Its silent presence was too unnerving. That night, Elena dreamt of a dark corridor lined with mirrors. In the reflections, she saw herself, but not quite. Her face was twisted, distorted, her eyes wide with terror. In the center of the corridor stood the mask, floating, whispering unintelligible words. She woke with a gasp, her heart racing. It was just a dream. Or was it? Elena thought she heard faint murmurs coming from the studio. She strained her ears, holding her breath. Nothing. After a few moments, she convinced herself it was just the creaking of her whole apartment. The next morning, Elena walked into her studio, determined to shake off the unease. But as she approached the mask, a faint sound stopped her in her tracks. It was soft, like a breeze carrying voices. She leaned closer. The whispering grew louder. "Do you want to know the truth?" Elena stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was clear, unmistakable. It was low and raspy, almost like a growl. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The whisper stopped. The room was silent again, save for the distant hum of traffic outside. She stared at the mask, her mind racing. It couldn't have spoken. Masks didn't talk. Maybe she was overworked, her imagination playing tricks on her. But as she turned to leave the room, she heard it again, fainter this time. "Do you want to know the truth?" Elena slammed the door behind her and fled to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she gripped a glass of water. The mask was just an object, a creepy, old object. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. Elena avoided the mask for the next 2 days, keeping her studio door shut and focusing on anything else. Cleaning, cooking, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. She told herself she'd been imagining things. Stress and lack of sleep had to be the culprits. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mask was watching her. Its hollow eyes burned in her mind every time she closed her own. Finally, on the 3rd night, unable to bear the weight of her own unease, Elena forced herself into the studio. The room felt colder than usual, and she hesitated at the door. The mask sat exactly where she'd left it, yet it seemed different somehow. Darker, more menacing. She stared at it, her breath quickening. "It's just a mask," she whispered. "Just an object." As if in response, the faint whispering started again. The words were clearer this time. "They mock you, every single one of them." Elena froze. "What?" she whispered back, her voice barely audible. "They don't see your talent," the voice continued. "They laugh behind your back. They pity you." She backed away, her hands trembling. "You're not real. This isn't real." But the mask's whispers persisted, weaving insidious doubts into her thoughts. Memories surfaced, half-heard comments from acquaintances, the tight smiles of gallery owners who politely declined her work, even Nathan's parting words when they'd broken up. "Maybe this just isn't for you." "No," she shouted, clutching her head. "Shut up." The whispering stopped abruptly. The room fell silent, but the weight of the mask's words lingered. She felt raw, exposed, as if someone had peeled away her skin and left her vulnerable to the cold air. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. The mask's voice echoed in her mind, its words merging with her own self-doubt. By morning, she was exhausted but driven. She set up her easel and began painting with a frenzy she hadn't felt in months. Her brush strokes were sharp and erratic, carving out haunting figures and dark landscapes. She didn't question where the ideas came from. She just painted. When she finally stepped back to look at the canvas, she barely recognized her work. The figure staring back at her was grotesque. its face stretched into a scream, its hollow eyes staring directly at her. Elena dropped the brush, her breathing shallow. The figure's eyes reminded her of the mask. She tried to shake the thought, telling herself it was coincidence, but she couldn't deny the truth. The mask was influencing her. It wasn't just a spark of inspiration, it was a parasite, feeding on her fears, her doubts, and her insecurities. As night fell, she resolved to leave the mask alone. Maybe she could sell it or give it away. She couldn't keep it, not if it continued to twist her thoughts like this. But as she lay in bed, trying to ignore the faint whispers she swore she heard through the walls, one thought crept into her mind. What if it's right? What if it's showing me the truth? Elena woke to a sharp knock at her door. Disoriented and still wrapped in the haze of a restless sleep, she stumbled to answer it. But when she swung the door open, no one was there. She stepped into the hallway of her apartment building, looking left and right. Nothing. The only sound was the hum of the overhead lights. Then she heard it. A faint, familiar whisper from inside her apartment. Heart pounding, Elena turned back to her open door. The whispering grew louder, beckoning her. She knew exactly where it was coming from. She found herself back in the studio, staring at the mask. It seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, its intricate carvings almost alive. The whispering stopped as she approached, and then it spoke. "Do you want to know why you've failed?" Elena's breath hitched. The voice was calm, steady, and chillingly clear. She should have run. She should have thrown the mask away, burned it even. But the question pierced something deep within her, something raw and aching. I don't know," she whispered. "They've never truly seen you," the mask said. "You've tried so hard to impress them, but the truth is, they aren't worthy of you." Elena swallowed hard. "That's not true. I'm not good enough." "You are," the mask insisted. "You always were. But they blinded you with doubt, made you question your worth. I can help you see clearly." Her hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers hovering just above the mask. "What do you mean?" "Wear me," the voice coaxed. "Let me show you the truth." Elena hesitated. The rational part of her screamed not to give in, but her desperation drowned out reason. If there was even a chance that the mask could give her clarity, help her understand why she felt so lost, she had to take it. Slowly, she lifted the mask and brought it to her face. The moment it touched her skin, an icy shock shot through her. The world blurred and darkened, and for a moment she thought she might faint. Then the visions began. She saw herself in vivid detail, standing in a crowded gallery. People surrounded her, whispering and pointing. Their faces were cruel, their words cutting. "Mediocre," one man sneered. "Derivative," said another. The scene shifted, and she was back in her studio, staring at her work. The paintings on the walls were twisted, grotesque versions of her art. She heard Nathan's voice behind her. "This is all you'll ever be." "No," Elena cried, trying to rip the mask from her face. But it wouldn't budge. "Do not resist," the mask said, its voice now inside her head. "These are the lies they told you. But I can give you power. I can make them see you for who you truly are." The pain in her chest ebbed as the visions changed. Now she saw herself standing tall, her artwork glowing with an ethereal light. Crowds flocked to her gallery, their faces full of awe and reverence. They chanted her name, begged for more. "I can make this real," the mask promised. "All you have to do is trust me." Elena's heartbeat slowed as a strange calm washed over her. The whispers in her mind softened, turning sweet and alluring. For the first time in months, she felt wanted. "Show me how," she whispered. The mask pulsed against her skin. "Let me in completely." The moment Elena surrendered, the mask seemed to meld into her. The cold sensation was gone, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire body. Her vision sharpened, and colors in the room became vibrant, almost unnaturally so. She walked to her easel as if guided by an unseen force. Her hand reached for the brush without hesitation, moving with a confidence she'd never known. The first stroke was bold and precise, the second even more so. Shapes and figures emerged rapidly, almost as if the painting created itself. Hours passed in a blur. When she finally stepped back, she saw something extraordinary. The canvas was alive with a dark beauty, a swirling vortex of shadows and light, figures twisting within it. It felt raw, powerful, and utterly unlike anything she had ever painted before. Elena's heart raced. For the first time, she felt like her art truly spoke. The mask's voice purred in her mind. "This is what you're capable of when you trust me. Do you see it now?" "I do," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "Good," it replied. "This is only the beginning." Over the next few days, Elena's work transformed. Painting after painting poured out of her, each one more haunting and mesmerizing than the last. Her studio walls became a gallery of unsettling brilliance. Word spread quickly. A local curator visited after hearing about her new work from a friend. His jaw dropped when he saw her pieces, and he immediately offered her a solo exhibition at his gallery. Elena was stunned. "Really? You think it's good enough?" "Good enough?" the curator said, laughing. "It's revolutionary. These are unlike anything I've ever seen." As he left, promising to finalize the details, Elena sat down, her thoughts spinning. This was everything she'd ever wanted. Recognition, validation, a chance to prove herself. But as she stared at her work, doubt began to creep back in. The paintings were beautiful, yes, but they were also disturbing. The figures looked tortured, their faces twisted with fear and despair. She glanced at the mask, now resting on her workbench. "This is too much," she said aloud. "It doesn't feel like me." The mask's voice was immediate and sharp. "It is you, the real you, the part you've buried under years of self-doubt. But, no buts," it snapped. "This is your chance to rise above them all. Or would you rather go back to being invisible?" Elena clenched her fists. She didn't want to be invisible. She wanted to matter. That night, she donned the mask again. The visions were stronger this time, almost overwhelming. She saw herself towering over a sea of admirers, their faces glowing with adoration. But there were shadows among them, figures watching from the edges, their eyes cold and calculating. "Who are they?" she asked the mask. "The ones who will try to stop you," it said. "They envy your talent. They fear your power. You must be ready to destroy them before they destroy you." Elena shivered. "Destroy them? How?" "You'll see," the mask whispered. The next morning, Elena awoke to find another painting on her easel, one she didn't remember creating. It was darker than the rest, depicting a crowd of faceless figures reaching toward a glowing figure in the center. As she stared at it, unease twisted in her stomach. The mask hummed softly from the workbench, its presence suffocating. "This is your destiny," it said. "Embrace it, or lose everything." The gallery exhibition was packed. People shuffled shoulder to shoulder, their voices a low murmur as they studied Elena's paintings. The works radiated a dark, magnetic energy that seemed to grip every viewer. Elena watched from the corner, her heart pounding. Her success was undeniable. The curator approached her with a wide grin. "This is incredible, Elena. I've already had offers pouring in," he said. "Collectors are obsessed." She nodded, forcing a smile, but unease gnawed at her. As the night wore on, snippets of conversations reached her ears. "It's beautiful, but unsettling. Did you notice all the faces? It's like they're screaming. There's something wrong about this." Elena's pulse quickened. The praise she craved felt hollow, overshadowed by the undertones of fear in their voices. As the last guests left and the gallery emptied, she lingered among her paintings. In the dim light, the figures on the canvases seemed to shift, their hollow eyes following her. The mask's voice was a whisper in her mind. "They're afraid because they cannot comprehend greatness. You have surpassed them all." Elena clenched her fists. "But at what cost? This doesn't feel like me." "You are more you now than you've ever been," the mask replied. She shook her head and stormed out of the gallery. Back in her apartment, the mask sat waiting for her on the workbench. She threw it into a drawer and slammed it shut. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed her into her dreams that night, twisting into nightmares. She saw herself painting endlessly, her hands bleeding as the mask urged her on. Shadows loomed around her, faceless figures closing in, their cold fingers clawing at her skin. She woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. For days, Elena avoided the mask, but it was futile. The more she resisted, the louder its voice became, seeping into her thoughts and warping her reality. One evening, as she sat in her studio staring at a blank canvas, the whispers turned into a low growl. "You can't silence me," the mask hissed. "You've already let me in. We're one now." "No," she muttered, clutching her head. "You're not real. I don't need you. Then why haven't you thrown me away?" Elena froze. The question hit her like a physical blow. She had considered it, but every time she tried, something stopped her. Fear, curiosity, or perhaps deep down, a twisted sense of reliance. She opened the drawer slowly, the mask's glow spilling out like a beacon. "I'll give you everything you want," it whispered. "Fame, power, legacy. All I ask is your loyalty." Elena's hands hovered over the mask. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." "You are my chosen," the mask said, "and together we will create something eternal." As she lifted the mask, her reflection in the nearby mirror caught her eye. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something else staring back at her. Something not entirely human. But she didn't stop. When the mask touched her face, the darkness consumed her completely. The mask fit tighter than before, as if it had fused with her skin. Elena gasped as a surge of energy coursed through her, a wave so powerful it made her knees buckle. Her vision swam, the edges of her apartment dissolving into a shifting, shadowy void. When the world stabilized, she was no longer in her studio. She stood in a cavernous hall, its walls adorned with massive, grotesque paintings. The works were alive, their subjects writhing and screaming silently within their frames. "Elena," the mask's voice echoed, louder and more commanding than ever. "This is your legacy." "No," she whispered, backing away. "This isn't what I wanted." "You wanted greatness," the mask growled. "You wanted to be seen, and now you are." The hall shuddered, the paintings vibrating violently. Figures began stepping out of their frames, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Each one bore the face of someone she recognized: the curator, her professors, Nathan. "Look what you've done," they hissed in unison. "Look at what you've become." Elena turned and ran, but the hall stretched endlessly. The figures closed in, their hands clawing at her. She stumbled, falling to the cold, shifting floor. The mask tightened, its voice cutting through her panic. "Stop running. They are nothing. You have the power to destroy them." Elena clenched her fists, trembling. The darkness within her rose like a tide, and she felt her fear shift into something darker: anger. She stood, her breath ragged, and turned to face the advancing figures. With a cry, she raised her hands. Shadows erupted from her, engulfing the figures in a tidal wave of black. They screamed as they were swallowed, their voices fading into silence. When the shadows receded, the hall was empty. Elena stood alone, her chest heaving. Her hands were stained with black, her reflection in a nearby frame twisted and unrecognizable. "Do you see now?" the mask said. "This is your truth. You are no longer their pawn. You are their master." Tears streamed down her face as she looked at her hands. "I never wanted this." "But you needed it," the mask replied. The hall shifted again, morphing into her studio. Her latest painting stood on the easel, fully complete. It was a self-portrait, but not the one she had intended. The figure on the canvas wore the mask, its hollow eyes glowing with malevolence. "No," she muttered, stumbling back. "This isn't me." "It is," the mask hissed. "It has always been you." In a final act of defiance, Elena grabbed a palette knife and plunged it into the painting, slashing through the canvas. The mask shrieked, the sound reverberating through her skull. But as the painting tore, so did her reflection in the studio mirror. Cracks spiderwebbed across the glass, and she felt a searing pain in her chest. The mask's voice faltered. "What have you done?" "I'm ending this," she gasped, ripping the mask from her face. It came off with a sickening tear, and she screamed as it hit the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The studio fell silent. Elena collapsed to her knees, the air heavy and still. When she looked up, the painting was gone, replaced by a blank canvas. The shards of the mask lay scattered around her, lifeless and dull. For the first time in weeks, the whispers were gone. She sat there for hours, staring at the empty canvas, her thoughts a jumbled mess. The mask had taken so much from her, but it had also revealed a truth she couldn't ignore. The darkness it fed on was hers all along. When she finally rose, she picked up her brush. This time, she would paint for herself.